Thank you very much indeed, Adrian, and to Herbert Smith Freehills for hosting us here this morning. Welcome from me, I'm Peter Unwin from the Whitehall Industry Group, so a big welcome from WIG. Now, we took some big decisions on both sides of the Atlantic last year, and this week we start to see a hint, again on both sides of the Atlantic, of how those decisions might play out. And it was a pretty tough year for opinion pollsters as well, as they grappled with the changes in sort of social and political trends and the way people vote and how they vote. And Ben will no doubt say a bit about that. But our speaker today, Ben Page, is much more than an opinion pollster. He's Chief Executive of Ipsos MORI. He's been with them for 30 years. In that time, he's worked with many major organisations across the sectors, many of them WIG members, helped them on issues such as corporate reputation and consumer research. And he's also a speaker and a talker on leadership and performance management. I've known Ben for some time, and I've always found Ben not only extremely informative, but also entertaining at the same time. So
no pressure.
Without pressure, let's look forward to what he's going to say today. I'm sure he won't disappoint. Just before handing over to him, you've heard the important housekeeping announcements from Adrian, but a couple more from me. Mobile phones off, please, or on silent. And we operate under the Chatham House rule for those of you who are new, and we have got a few newcomers here to welcome today. That means basically that you can use the information that you hear, but please don't attribute it either to Ben or any of the questioners in the Q&A session. Ben will talk for about 25 minutes, half an hour, and leave time for questions, so please be thinking of the questions that you want to ask him. With that, over to Ben.
Thank you. So, it's lovely to see you all. You're my first gig since I had a triple hernia operation a week ago, so which it's an interesting experience. When a surgeon tells you that it's only a couple of little stitches, I've now learned don't believe them. Anyway, if you want the slides, do email me, or I'm sure they'll be on the Whitehall Industry Group website, so you can have them. There's a few new things that are out fresh this morning for you, looking at populism, which we've just done. And I think, the main issue is really that actually things haven't yet changed that much. And we're constantly told in business and in government that everything's changed. And I guess, yes, we've moved all the departments around, but many of you old Whitehall hands are used to having your departments moved around regularly anyway and reapplying for your own jobs, so it won't be that big a shock. And obviously my industry is about making its clients desperate for more information, so I'm keen on telling you everything, but actually, 10 years ago, before Facebook existed, we were still probably sitting in places like this, listening to PowerPoint presentations, wearing clothes, So things don't necessarily change quite as much, but there, certainly things are uncertain. And this is the 45th President of the United States, and he really wasn't supposed to win. He didn't win. He lost by 2.8 million votes overall, where the polls actually were remarkably accurate, to within 1 percentage point. There was just a small matter of the 3 states where they got it wrong, where he won by 70,000 votes. But certainly, polling is a tricky business in the sense that it relies mostly on what has worked in the past. In France, for example, and we have the French presidential elections coming up, where my colleagues tell me that it is impossible for Marine Le Pen to win, so go and start your bets on her now. The reason for that, of course, is that we have 2 rounds of voting. But just to give you an idea about how tricky polling can be when you're trying to deal with what human beings say, often some days in advance of an event, and then what they actually do. In France, the traditional way of dealing with the Front National in polling terms was to take whatever the voters told you they were going to do in terms of the percentage that would vote for the Front National, and then double it. And that turned out, because of desirability bias, to be the most accurate method. The challenges with polling, of course, that's no longer necessary. All the Front National supporters in France are proud to tell you they're going to be voting Front National. There is no problem of overclaim anymore. So this is the challenge. When the political weather changes, it's hard to spot it changing until it's happened, because all of our assumptions are often based on previous experience. Nevertheless, there are certain things that we know are happening and will happen, and some of these we can quickly gloss over. So here are things that we know definitely are going to happen. You don't need to pay me any money to hear this, but they're happening. Technology will carry on improving. Did you buy an Alexa? Has anybody bought an Alexa to talk to over Christmas? There's one at the back. Many more of you will be talking to Alexa over the next 2 or 3 years, and you can come back to me if you don't. Uneven economic growth, I think, is almost certain. That was, we talked about this for a number of years, but even within countries, and As Stephanie Flanders, ex of the BBC, put it once, London is a great city attached to a crap country. Across Europe, we've got the French and the Italians almost suicidal. We're still actually relatively cheerful, and the Germans and the Swedes over the moon. Climate change is going to happen. If you imagine the hottest summer you can ever remember, just imagine that as a sort of normal summer in your planning, and that's probably likely to happen. Population change. One of the most certain things is demography. We know that the population's aging. We can do quite good forecasts on that. Migration, which is another challenge, and industry and political change, of course, is much, much more difficult. Back in 1990, Francis Fukuyama, of course, famously predicted the end of history. We're all going to live in liberal democracies. As the events of the last year have shown, history does not move in a straight line. And that type of thing isn't quite certain, but we can be certain that it will change. And of course, although we're trying in Brexit today, as Mrs May makes her announcements at Lancaster House this morning, to control migration into Britain, how successful we'll be at that at the same time as protecting the economy is going to be interesting. And globalisation, it may go into reverse, but some of the forces behind it are inexorable, and it's really about how we cope with it. And Brexit was one way of coping with the effects of globalisation. So they'll all happen. And actually, really, many of the fundamentals haven't particularly changed. It's just this sort of sense of uncertainty. And the other issue is, for those of you who've read Steven Pinker, and if you haven't and want to be cheered up by Steven Pinker and read about the world, but this is two things that the penetration or frequency of owning two things back in 1975, when many of us in this room were alive: central heating and washing machines in Britain. In 1975, most of us were using fires of various sorts, electric or coal or otherwise, to heat our homes. We forget this stuff. We are awash with stuff. Life is infinitely better in many ways, material ways, than back in the 1970s, and yet we're just worried about the future. 88% are worried about the future. And so how should we respond? I think the first thing is all of the evidence from people like Tetlock looking at prediction. I don't know if you've read Super Forecasting or any of his earlier books. But the evidence on experts, and we'll look at what the public says about experts in a minute, is that experts are about 5% more accurate than random chance. It varies from field to field. But once you know that, then I think it does mean that you need to be better prepared for a different range of scenarios. And whichever sector we look at, I think one of the things that's fascinating is when you just... The reason I'm thinking of this is because I'm sitting in a big commercial office block in the city, and I was doing a piece of work last week for looking at the commercial property market and how they react to cycles, which are endemic in their industry. And of course, the interesting thing is that they're now quite a few years from their last big upset, and many of the people now who are rising in prominence in the industry weren't around at the time it happened, and so they're starting to think that low interest rates, etc., are normal. But we need, I think, being able to react to a range of different scenarios must be absolutely central, and because we are in a period of much more uncertainty. I was asked to talk a little bit about technology, and I think one thing that is perhaps different is just the level of distraction that we all now have. Back in the 1980s, if you were communicating with the public, you would have been using one of those 5 channels. Now you can use all of these. And all of these are vying for your attention every single day. The average sort of AB professional in London now looks at this thing about 200 times a day. Very often, though, it's a bit like going to the fridge. You go to the fridge, look, and is there any milk? And then about 5 minutes later, you go back in to look at the fridge. Is there any milk? No, there's still no milk there, but we're still sort of instinctively tuned to have a look and see if things interesting. And that constant craving for attention of various sorts is a challenge. Mrs. Baroness Greenfield says, of course, that this is rotting the brains of your children. It's stopping them developing empathy. They're just constantly online playing computer games and talking to their friends. They never talk to anybody. Of course, Ben Goldacre of Bad Science says this is bollocks. But it is true that we've got most people in China saying they're constantly looking at screens. The figure for Britain is actually slightly lower. And he says, and he might know something about this, that there is an issue about the ability to think clearly, that we're so... we know that we do tasks better. Many of us like to multitask all the time, but the evidence is that we're better if we concentrate. And so how we stop that sort of distraction might be something we'd want to think about. But I'm going to talk today about my winners and losers of 2016. And one of the winners, of course, is the hackers, who are much better than any of us ever imagined, it would appear. And if you haven't been hacked yet, then Just wait, because they'll get to you in the end. We had some malware, Trojan-type malware, that attempted to be installed on our system recently. Fortunately, we found it, but that was, it's a challenge. So certainly some of the winners of 2016 were the hackers. Another winner is Facebook, and of course this is this is something that's changing, or that Facebook has to grow up and realise that it is actually a news medium, not just a sort of happy, innocent platform that sits there innocently, just giving you all the truth. With its algorithms, of course, wanting you to look at more and more stuff, so they get more and more advertising revenue. I think the interesting thing about the internet is just how it's creating monopolies all of its own. I'm a massive Twitter addict. I love Twitter. I love the dopamine hits of attention. But if I wanted to talk to the public, and it's fascinating, you know, Trump has got that one-to-one connection with, I don't know, maybe 20 million, 30 million people now. It's probably going up hour by hour as we approach that moment on the 20th of January, when not many bands will play at his inauguration on Friday. But this is how many people in Britain look at social media and which ones they look at. All of the others, Snapchat, Instagram, Twitter, etc., are down at the bottom, and there is Facebook. And so if you want to talk to people, go on, make sure you're interesting and amusing and entertaining on Facebook. And if you're a political journalist, Twitter is great, and it's good for perhaps some professionals, but overall the public is on Facebook, and of course that is perhaps part of Donald Trump's success, being able to get those messages out there, perhaps beyond the reach of the Washington Post and the New York Times, direct to individuals. And that is a difference, because of course before we had fake news, we've always had fake news, but it was mediated in a way by the channels. They were sort of publicly visible. Now everybody's getting their own little algorithm, and you know, there's a town in Macedonia where all the kids are making, you know, tens of thousands of dollars a month by just producing fake stories for Americans to look at on Facebook. But at the same time, tradition is going on, and one of the interesting things in an age of constant change is actually how much of this is about harking back to an imagined past. So all over the world, people say that I want my country to be the way it used to be. 53% in Britain, just slightly more than the 51.8% who voted to return to pre-1975 conditions in Britain. And in America, of course, top, 69%. Only the Chinese and the Swedes and the South Koreans, perhaps the Germans, fortunately, less enthusiastic about that. But patriotic nostalgia was part of what drove support for Trump. When we did Bayesian analysis looking at why people were voting for Trump, it's a mixture of not liking immigrants, but also the feeling the system is broken, being worried about other people. In America, people believe that about 19% of the population are Muslims. The actual figure is 1%. But they're scared of Muslims at the moment. And so all of these things together, plus, of course, a very weak, in many ways, candidate in opposition to him, Hillary Clinton, of course, gets Trump over the line. But a lot of it is this sense about the past being better, not being able to achieve the American dream, the past being better than the future. But in advertising, this is happening in our culture across the piece. So, you know, I was wandering around North London, and, you know, tough but gentle for 100 years. Hovis, after the crash, just ran adverts straight from the 1970s without any editing at all. Just put them back up. Saves money, actually, on advertising edge. You just play the old ad again. And, you know, in our car, we've got sort of cars that look sort of like old cars. You know, the new Mini, it's like on steroids compared to the old Mini. But it's this sort of harking back to the past, which is, you know, we didn't do that in the 1950s. We didn't make cars that looked like Model T Fords in the 1950s and 60s, but we do now. On the other hand, when we talk about the past, we aren't necessarily wanting to go back to actually the precise past, even if many aspects of it are attractive. So you can see that the idea that women should stay at home and look after families is popular in Russia, but not really in Britain. There's a core 24% of people in Britain believe that, but they will mostly be dead in the next 15 years. And everywhere else, it's not a particularly popular idea. So we choose those parts of nostalgia that we want to hang on to. And I think that at that point, which is something I want to return to, about this selection of curation of attention or ideas, that we're choosing what we want to believe, is very important. The latest poll that we'll just put out tomorrow looks at, you know, this idea that somehow we've been repressing what people really think is quite strong all over the world. Politicians should be able to say what's on their minds regardless of what anyone thinks about their views. So, you know, 80% in Israel and Hungary, 79%. In Britain, it's 64%. Only in Japan and South Africa is it below 50%, and it's still a lot of people. So yes, if you want to go and say all sorts of outrageous things, you should be allowed to do so. Experts don't understand the lives of people like me. And actually, one of the things after the referendum and the election, I was reflecting is that, I look at, my staff are diverse. They come from places all over Britain, but they have been living in London, in metropolitan London, in a firm that is comprised of 30% of people from the European Union, and they sit around, and they're all sort of probably liberal metropolitan types, I suspect. I do find it fascinating though. We don't like the elite. The elite all voted for Remain, so that's 48% of this country are the elite. It's a bit overblown, but nevertheless, experts. I'm not sure about experts understanding people like me. 59% in Britain say that's true. It doesn't mean that 40% think experts do understand them. Some people don't have an opinion, by the way. So. I want a strong leader to break the rules. Now, Britain actually is not the top on this. We're in the mid-table. About half of us fancy that idea. The French are really fed up with everything, professionally miserable, 80%. So that, again, does that mean that Marine Le Pen might actually do it? I don't know. Whereas Germany, we're rather less keen. So maybe Merkel, down at the bottom, only 21% wants sort of Adolf or somebody like that. So who knows, but the difference between France and Germany is very, very marked, and it will be fascinating to see this year if that plays out in any of the elections that they're having. But certainly, lots of difference, but quite a lot of iconoclasm, a sense that we've got to change things. And the other challenge that we face, and particularly if any of you are involved in any way in talking to the public, is this sense of complexity that we all face. So whether you're an emerging market or an established market, whether you're young or old, most people say, I want my life to be simpler. It's nearly 6 out of 10 people across the world. Now, it's possibly true that if I'd done this survey in 1717 or 1517, that people, oh yes, there's so many books coming out today, now they've got the printing press, I don't know how to keep up, etc., etc. But nevertheless, it's there. And what we do know, for example, that if you're in retailing and you offer people 25 varieties of jam, you sell less than if you offer them 8 varieties of jam carefully chosen, because the plethora of choice just paralyses people. And one thing we've done, this government, the last Conservative government did, of course, was to take away a choice introduced by Mrs. Thatcher. She gave people freedom to decide whether or not to have an occupational pension. They looked at the range of occupational pensions available. It was very complicated. They thought it was of deferred gratification a long time in the future, but I need money now. So we end up with a quarter of the population without an occupational pension. And as this behavioural economist puts it, choice, complexity and limited attention span can lead to behavioural market failure. So we took away that choice for the public, and we are gradually dealing with the problem. So sometimes choice isn't good for us, even if ostensibly we crave it. So how we curate things for people and keep things simple, I think, is hugely important. Generational differences are something that we've been majoring on for a number of years now, and I think that's one of the things, of course, that we saw with Brexit, with the under 45s voting to stay, older generations voting to leave, and it affects all sorts of things. This is long-term data from the British Social Attitude Study, and what this is showing is showing the people who say they always support the same party. So are you basically Tory or Labour or Liberal or something? And the generation born before 1945, we can look at them when they were interviewed in their 30s and 40s in the early 1980s at the top of this chart. They gradually get older, but their views don't change. So they always say, yeah, I always vote Labour, I always vote Tory. My generation, and that of many of us in this room, the baby boomers, 1945 to 1965, we're much less party loyal. But we've stayed apart from our parents' generation, but we're still more loyal than the generation who came after us, Generation X, 66 to 79, again, many of you in this room, and they are more loyal still. Who's born after 1980, please? So you're the most miserable people in the room, and you're really not party loyal. And now, because the people at the top of the chart haven't discovered the gift of eternal life, they will eventually disappear. And when they disappear, their views will be replaced by everybody else. And everybody else has different views to them. So what that means is in the early 1980s, half the electorate, 51%, always going to vote for the same party, right or wrong. By just the early 2020s, with current mortality rates, that will be down to a quarter if nothing else changes. And that means, of course, that everything becomes much more volatile. And so we thought that political cross-dressing, the end of the Cold War, political scandals like the expensive scandal of 2009 had been the reason why politics was becoming much more flexible. But actually, it's just generational shift. Nobody's changing their mind, but the people are changing. And that has all sorts of interesting issues, because one of the groups of losers of 2016 were, of course, the young. Only in China do most people think their life is going to be better than their parents. Everywhere else they don't. Britain, France, down at the bottom. And back in Britain, in April of 2013, we had 12% of people saying that youth will have a worse life than their parents. By 2011, it was 35%, and by February of last year, it was 54%. And that's unparalleled, certainly in polling post-war history, that people are becoming so negative about what's going to happen. Now again, will it really become true? Was the last 30 years just a nice blip where everything lined up for Western Europe, and after that, the spoils go to the south and east of the world, and Europe has a really tough time? I don't know, but certainly that pessimism is there, even if they are voting to remain. This is quite interesting. This is how people would describe baby boomers on the right and these people on the left. And I thought this was interesting. So people are really nasty about millennials. These are the words that people globally would use to describe them. And these are, for us, baby boomers, 1945 to 1960. This has a respectful, well-educated, ethical. So I thought that's interesting, because we're meant to be the people who've stolen their futures, right? But apparently not. And then when I looked at the data, I thought, well, this is fine. It's just going to be middle-aged people saying that their generation is lovely, and everyone, casting aspersions on the youth. But when I look at the millennials themselves, of course, they'll be saying that, yes, they're forthright, they're the ethical ones. Actually, not true. We're going to publish this in March. Millennials themselves are nastier about themselves than they are about anybody else. So I don't know what that means. We really do have a lazy, arrogant, selfish, materialistic, but tech-savvy generation coming through. But there is something going on. Trust obviously had a problem long before fake news of any sort. Some of the winners and losers in trust, politicians not doing so well, and our winners on trust in 2016 were in fact nurses who had supplanted doctors as the most trusted people in Britain. These are people where more people trust them than don't. So nurses, doctors doing rather well, and this of course, although we haven't yet hit the tipping point on the National Health Service, if we do have vast numbers of doctors and nurses starting to come out and say it's all the government's fault and that's why people are dying in the corridors, that might be a time to print some more money. Police don't do badly, and actually civil servants, look at that, doing okay, better than pollsters. We've got still more people trust me than not, and I do better than all these people. With, of course, politicians hitting a new low in 2016, only 15% saying that they'll tell the truth, and overall their net score is minus 67. Although, interestingly, journalists are now doing better than government ministers, which is perhaps a challenge, but not quite as well as estate agents. But overall, all over the world, people aren't particularly chuffed with their governments. I mean, in Italy, we managed to find 3% who thought their government was doing a good job. I assume these people are either married into it or working for it in some way. Generally, it's not very fashionable to think government's very good, and to be honest, that isn't going to change anytime soon. So then the question is, well, who do we trust? And this is the really interesting thing. We sort of trust random people we've never met who may be completely unqualified to pass judgment about anything. But obviously they have no axe to grind, and so must be people really worth looking at. And I think, again, you need to watch that quite carefully. Because what the public believes it has, or certainly what it wants, is this sense of authenticity, which is why they like people like Nigel, who we shall return to in a second. He's a very authentic metals trader from Dulwich. So you get things like this. Dear Sainsbury's, why is tiger bread called when it should be called giraffe bread? Love from Lily Robinson, age 3.5. And Sainsbury's write back a lovely letter. Yes, you're right. It should be called giraffe bread. I'll think about changing it. And this goes viral on the internet. Isn't Sainsbury's wonderful? They're really understanding their consumers. So this is good. We've sort of tapped into the zeitgeist. We're responsive. We're real. We're listening to people. £3 gift card, very cheap to get lots of publicity. What you don't want to be is like Argyll and Bute Council. Argyll and Bute Council had a pupil who had a website she'd started. She was only about 11 or something, and it was called Never Seconds. And every day she took a photo of her lunch and then posted it online. Now, this may explain why life expectancy in some parts of Scotland is lower than in other parts of Europe. Anyway, but Argyll and Bute weren't big on social media, so it took them some months to notice that this was happening. But eventually, they sprang into action. They expelled her because she refused to stop doing it. Now, of course, unfortunately, the child knows about social media, so she gets onto Twitter And very quickly, Madonna, Jamie Oliver, and various other people, 380,000 other people are then emailing Arbarn and Bute Council about their outrageous treatment of the child. And I think by 5 p.m. she's back in school. So just be careful is my advice on this one. Because, you know, truth is all in the eye of the beholder these days. That is perhaps one of the challenges, I think. You know, and one of the things that we found is that people are just very wrong about all sorts of things. We look at just how wrong people are on a regular basis. And this isn't to mock people, but it's to understand what judgments people might be making. So we've done this in 40 countries all over the world. But I thought this was interesting. This is France. Now, obviously, France has a problem with terrorism at the moment. So we asked people in 2020, out of every 100 people, how many will be Muslim? And the estimates are from the French Office of Statistics that it will be about 8%. But the French population, what do you think they'd guess it will be?
25.
Sorry?
25.
40. Very good. So they're guessing, the average French person guesses that 4 out of 10 people in France will be Muslims in the next 3 years. I mean, you know. Well, let's try another one here. This is interesting. I mean, we just had Blue Monday, didn't we? Yesterday was meant to be the most miserable day of the year, wasn't it? So let's have a look at happiness. This is, we asked people, you know, if I do a survey of the British and ask them how happy they are, how many people will say they're happy? Any idea what the actual number might be in this survey? Okay. No idea? 70? Okay. And okay, what do you think the guess is when they ask about everybody else? How many people, other people, are going to be happy in this country?
40.
So, you know, people are generally happier, younger, you know, more God-fearing in every way than their fellow citizens believe they are. So we're much too pessimistic in many ways, and I think that's important to remember that. You know, post-truth is the word of the year. I quite like the German word of the year, post-factisch. And some of this stuff that we're seeing here, of course, is emotional numeracy. People don't sit in the pub and go, how many of the population do you think are Muslims then? So when I pop up and ask you, okay, so how many people are Muslims then? You don't want to say, well, I'm a bit worried about Muslims. I've heard bad things about Muslims recently. So you don't want to sort of say, well, it's 5%, do you? You say something much higher to sort of reflect not what it actually is, but to reflect your level of anxiety, perhaps, about terrorism. Normalisation, of course, that's a real challenge. You know, we know that if people believe that everybody else does much less exercise than they do, they feel much more relaxed about doing less exercise themselves. So I think there is a big job in truth-telling if we can make it. And actually, maybe if you look at 2016, actually what happened, despite all of the data showing other things, if you're perhaps as unhappy and as fearful as some of the survey data suggests people are, rightly or wrongly, that might explain our sort of sudden switch to populism. Now, whether that is a real pattern in terms of a switch to populism, we will see this year. You know, human beings love populism, so we immediately allied Brexit with Trump, and then we allied, you know, Marine Le Pen, and then it's all going to go to, you know, some sort of massive sort of fracas. But maybe not. Maybe the centre actually will turn out to hold. We don't know, but we love looking for patterns. So our winners of the year in politics, certainly Nigel. Definitely. When Americans love winners, it's interesting. This is how many people liked Donald Trump before he became President of the United States, at 37%. But immediately after he won, 46% said they liked him, because Americans back winners, you know. So whether they'll continue to back him in office. Actually, interestingly, after his most recent pronouncements and some of the other stuff that has come out, it's gone back to 36%. But anyway. Other winners, small towns. Those of us from the big city, you know, need to remember that actually what happened in 2016 is that small towns are the places that voted for Brexit, and we, the metropolitan liberal elite, have forgotten. And they are winners, or at least they feel they're winners at the moment. Now, whether they're going to be winners, I don't know, but that's, you know, they certainly won. Bad dog Mattis, I love him. Be polite, be professional, have a plan to kill him. Now, actually, I thought that Matt, I'd like to, you know, who's yours? You know, so you go to some international negotiations and you go, who's this? My Secretary of State Defence. What's he called? Mad Dog. I mean, that would be quite, but actually Mad Dog turns out to be remarkably sane. There was at his confirmation hearing in the States last week, he was asked, so what do you think about LGBT people in the forces? And he goes, I don't much care what consenting adults do in bed. And then he said he thought that Putin was the greatest threat to world peace there is. So actually I'm coming round to Mad Dog. I think Mad Dog, he's a winner. Other winners, obviously our Prime Minister is a winner. Now it's always, of course, helpful to be compared to something else, so we'll come on to what she's compared to in a minute, but she is currently enjoying a long honeymoon. Her ratings are, this is how Prime Ministers are rated. or the parties leave. So you can see Blair in 1997, you can see Cameron in 2010, Mrs Thatcher and John Major, and here's Theresa. So Theresa is doing only to Tony Blair in terms of her support after becoming in terms of her support after becoming Prime Minister of her party. And of course part of that is because Jeremy, bless him, Jeremy is not a winner. Jeremy is definitely a loser. This is how Jeremy compares to previous leaders of the opposition. And the clue is in this dotted line on the chart. You only get to be Prime Minister in this country if your ratings in opposition as an individual are above the dotted line. So Jeremy isn't quite as bad as some people have been, but he's certainly not heading in the right direction. So that we'll see what happens there. Again, seeing Tristram Hunt's seat in Stoke and seeing what happens with UKIP. I mean, again, a big test for UKIP. They've got lots of ambition. I'm suspecting that the referendum for hanging, or the reintroduction of hanging, will be mooted soon by UKIP if it hasn't already. But whether they'll be able to take Stoke off, but if they are, I mean, given that Labour have been annihilated in their traditional homeland of Scotland, when they're, where we really are probably, if you're a sort of Labour type person, you have to think of this as about 1985, 1986. So another 11 years to go until 1997. So get used to Conservative government. Other losers, Marmite, and consumer confidence down 28 points in 1 month. Once they were, not immediately after Brexit, actually confidence rose in the 3 months after Brexit, but as soon as they found out that prices might be going up, which 67% are now concerned about, consumer confidence has fallen. People are still spending, and that's driving, of course, keeping us going. How long that will be, we don't quite know. Other losers, of course, immigrants, and our friends from the millions of people from Europe who are currently here. And of course, whatever anybody argues about Brexit, it is about controlling immigration, and I think indeed Theresa May's speech today is making that point. We are having the type of Brexit to allow us to do something about this. Now, we will gloss over the fact that the majority of immigrants just coming into this country come from outside the European Union, so in theory we might have been able to control that ourselves. And we'll gloss over the fact that probably we will have to let a lot of people who've already come here stay, because, for all sorts of reasons, but nevertheless, there it is. It was the top reason. And of course, the interesting thing about the polling since the referendum is that people aren't changing their minds yet. There is really, there's really not much sign of any buyer's remorse on either side, even though most people voting Leave did not expect it to happen. They didn't actually think they would win. They just thought they'd register a protest. But nevertheless, we aren't seeing sort of massive switches. So we will see. Other winners, of course, old people, which is good for all of us. I'm 52. This is income distribution, according to the Institute of Fiscal Studies. This is who's got better off and worse off. So we saw that people are pessimistic about the young, and maybe they're right to do so. These are your real median incomes over the last 7 or 8 years, and obviously with the triple lock helping pensioner incomes, and people in their under 30 having a much more difficult time of it. But of course not all older people are winners, and of course those relying on social care are definitely losers, and how that will pan out, where that goes, who's going to pay, nobody knows. I think ultimately though the winner of 2016 is this. If I show you that series of numbers, you will look at the thing in the middle and say, it's number 13, right? And so if you listen to Donald Trump, America is a completely terrible place, all the jobs have gone, it's being ripped off by China, Mexican rapists are pouring into the country, it's all hell in a handcart. And conversely, you can look at exactly the same thing in Daily Mail. Britain is an absolute disaster area, migrant hordes, thieving scum, ripping off our NHS, etc. However, you can also look at it this way. Depending on what I show you, you have a completely different view of what the thing in the middle is. So I'm expecting the Daily Mail soon to swing round to how wonderful it is. Yes, we don't have quite as much money, but how fun it is to go on holiday to Skegness every year with the neighbours and all the rest of it. I'm being sarcastic, but a lot of this is about how we decide to look at things, how we choose to look at things, how it gets framed. Even if I'm selling you ice cream, which is my main part of my business these days, if I tell you I'm about to give you some delicious ice cream, you're much more likely to enjoy it. So when you serve up dinner to your family tonight, they say, I'm serving you some delicious food, and they will enjoy it more. And so framing and how we present things and what we choose to look at may be as important as anything else in the coming years. Thank you very much. I think I'll stop there.